Your neighbor drives a 15-year-old Honda. The paint's faded on the hood. One hubcap doesn't match the others. It's been parked in that same driveway for as long as you've lived on this street. He just retired at 40, and you can't stop thinking about it. You met him properly for the first time 2 years ago, carrying groceries in from your car while he was doing the same. You'd nodded at each other before, the way neighbors do, but that day you actually talked. His name was Marcus, mid-30s then, plain t-shirt, worn sneakers. Nothing about him suggested anything other than an ordinary guy living an ordinary life. You assumed he worked some standard 9-to-5, maybe mid-level at some company. You didn't think about it much because there was nothing to think about. He blended in perfectly with the modest, forgettable rhythm of suburban life. That was 2 years ago. You, meanwhile, were doing well. Genuinely well. A solid job, a newer car, a house one size bigger than you probably needed because you could afford it. And because, if you're honest, it felt good to be seen affording it. You weren't reckless. You just believed, the way most people do, that visible success was supposed to look a certain way. Marcus's house never looked like anything. Over the next 2 years, you noticed small things without really registering them as patterns. Marcus's Honda never changed, even as everyone else in the neighborhood upgraded cars every few years like clockwork. His house never got renovated, never got a new driveway, never got the kind of visible upgrades that signal things are going well. He wore the same 3 or 4 t-shirts on rotation. He packed his own lunch every day you happened to see him leave for work. He didn't take flashy vacations, or if he did, he never mentioned them, never posted them. You started to form a quiet, unspoken assumption about him. Not unkind exactly, just a story you told yourself.
That he was probably just getting by. Steady, unambitious, comfortable with less. You didn't think less of him for it. You just placed him in a category and stopped thinking about it further. Then one Tuesday morning, you saw him in his backyard at 10 a.m. on a weekday, just sitting there, coffee in hand, reading, completely unhurried. You assumed he was between jobs. Maybe he'd been laid off. You almost felt bad for him. I think Marcus lost his job, you said. Poor guy. A week later, you saw him again. Same time, same coffee, same unhurried calm. This went on for a month before curiosity finally got the better of you. You ran into him at the mailbox and asked, as casually as you could manage, "Hey, everything okay? Noticed you're home a lot lately." He smiled. Not embarrassed, not defensive, just genuinely amused. And said, "Yeah, I actually retired a few months ago." You laughed, assuming he was joking. He wasn't. Retired? You what, 40? 41, actually. You didn't know what to say. Retired at 41, driving a 15-year-old Honda, living in a house that hadn't been updated since it was probably built. Nothing about his life matched the word retired the way you understood it. You must have looked confused, because he laughed again and said, "It's not what you're picturing. There's no yacht, no inheritance. I just did the math differently than most people." That sentence stuck with you for weeks. You started paying closer attention after that conversation. You noticed Marcus wasn't cheap in a way that felt deprived. He just seemed to spend money on almost nothing that didn't directly add value to his life. No new car, because his old one still worked fine and got him where he needed to go. No renovated kitchen, because his kitchen already functioned perfectly well. No status purchases, because he simply didn't seem to care about status at all. Meanwhile, you started noticing your own spending differently too. The newer car you'd bought,
18 months before its predecessor was actually due for replacement. The house upgrade you'd made not because you needed the space, but because it felt like the natural next step once you could afford it. None of it was wrong, exactly, but none of it had actually been necessary either. You brought this up with Marcus over coffee one weekend. Actual coffee this time. Sitting on his porch, the same coffee he'd been drinking every weekday morning for the past year, while you assumed he was unemployed. So how does the math work, you asked? The version you did differently. He explained it simply. For 15 years, starting right out of college, he'd saved and invested a large percentage of every paycheck. Not an impressive percentage most people would find sustainable, but a percentage he'd built his entire life.
Not an impressive percentage most people would find sustainable, but a percentage he'd built his entire lifestyle around from the very beginning. So it never felt like sacrifice. He never upgraded his car because his car had never stopped being reliable. He never renovated his house because comfort, to him, had never required newness. Every dollar he didn't spend on status went instead into investments that, compounding quietly for over a decade, eventually grew large enough to support his living expenses indefinitely. "I'm not rich," he said, "not in the way people usually mean it. I just needed less than I thought I did, and I started early enough that the difference had time to grow." You sat with that for a long moment. You realized, sitting on that porch, that you'd spent 2 years quietly pitying a man who had already won a game you were still actively playing. A game he'd simply decided, years earlier, not to play by the same rules everyone else assumed were mandatory. The 15-year-old Honda wasn't a sign of struggling. It was a sign of a decision made over a decade earlier and never abandoned. The plain t-shirts weren't evidence of hardship. They were evidence of someone who'd simply never tied his identity to appearances in the first place. You went home that evening and looked at your own driveway. Newer car, bigger house, a lifestyle built quietly and gradually around looking successful rather than around actually being free. You didn't change everything overnight. Old habits don't work that way. But you started asking yourself questions you hadn't asked in years. Questions about what you were actually spending money to feel versus what you were spending money to show. Marcus never bragged about any of it. He never once, in all your conversations, made you feel foolish for not knowing. He simply answered honestly when you finally asked the right question. And that's the part that stays with you the most. Not the retirement, not the number in his accounts, not even the 15-year-old Honda still parked faithfully in his driveway. It's the realization that the entire time you were quietly judging him for having less, he'd actually already arrived somewhere you were still trying to get to. He just never felt the need to tell anyone. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, you started measuring your life by a different question. Not, does this look successful? But, does this actually make me free? You started writing it down so you wouldn't forget. You started sitting on your own porch more. No particular reason, just to sit. For the first time in a long time, you weren't in a hurry to be somewhere else. Marcus still waves when he sees you. You wave back. Nothing's really changed on the surface. His Honda still drives the same route it always has. Unhurried, unremarkable. From above, the two houses still look almost identical. Nobody driving past would know the difference. But you know the difference now. That's what changed. Two driveways, two very different definitions of made it. Only one of them was ever actually true. Your neighbor still drives a 15-year-old Honda. He's not going to trade it in anytime soon. And now, neither are you.